Grab your shipwright tools, wargamers. Today, we are taking apart the ship of Theseus so we can put it back together again and set out for a journey to the island of better wargaming. Before we can do that, though, we need to talk about a couple of fundamental rules of miniature wargaming and, to an extent, role-playing games as well. And that is the concept of Rule Zero. Rule Zero is a very dangerous thing because it's actually two rules bundled together under one heading. And because Rule Zero has a lot of different ways of understanding it, people will tend to make arguments and cite Rule Zero in one way when they're really talking about the other. So before we get too deep into how to improve your wargaming, let's take a closer look at Rule Zero. The first way to look at Rule Zero, and I'm going to call this Zero Prime for the sake of the rest of this video, for the sake of simplicity, is when a game developer acknowledges that he is writing a game that covers an infinitely complex situation. And that the only way to really create a game that does that is to create a game of infinite complexity. At a certain point, the designer throws his hands up and says, look, I've given you enough to play the game. You're going to encounter situations that I haven't anticipated. In the middle of your sword fight, a bunch of wild pigs wander in. How are you going to deal with that? Well, the game designer didn't tell us how to deal with wild pigs. We're on our own. We have to add our own rules. We have to massage the rule set. We have to fill in the holes that are left behind by the game designer. That's one understanding of Rule Zero. In fact, it goes all the way back to, let's take a look at chainmail. Let's take a look at how the great Gary Gygax dealt with the issue. For the record, this is my personal copy of all of the old D&D books. Sold by Wizards of the Coast. I went ahead and had them bound up in a hardcover to make it easier to reference them and store them all in one place. Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin dealt with Rule Zero thusly, and I'm going to read verbatim. Although the rules have been play tested over a period of many months, it is likely you will eventually find some part that seems ambiguous, unanswered, or unsatisfactory. When such a situation arises, settle it among yourselves. Record the decision in the rules book and abide by it from then on. These rules may be treated as guidelines around which you form a game that suits you. It is always a good idea to amend the rules to allow for historical precedence or common sense. Follow the spirit of the rules rather than the letter. Now, there are a lot of conditionals in there. Specifically, amend the rules to allow for historical precedence or common sense. This is an admission that no finite set of rules can account for an infinite set of variables, that infinite set that comes into war games. We're going to call that Rule Zero Prime. Here's a rule set. When you find holes in the rules, figure it out. Make up your own. Plug in those gaps. There's another approach to Rule Zero that says because you can make your own rules, and here's an example of somebody that started out making his own rules, Dave Arneson in Blackmore. Because you can do this, Rule Zero becomes the most important rule of all because it means none of the rules matter. None of the rules is sacrosanct. They can all be changed. Okay, let's take a look at what that looks like in practice. This second approach to Rule Zero, and we're going to call this Calvin Ball from the American comic strip by Bill Watterson, where Calvin Ball was, there are no rules. We make them up as we go along, and the points don't matter, and whatever happens, it just happens. I want to take a look at what happens when we apply this second Rule Zero to, hey, a simple war game. This, of course, is a chessboard, and there's one way to play the game of chess, and that's according to the rules of the Queen's Marquis of Queensberry. That's one way. But the other approach to Rule Zero says it's your game, and that's merely an acknowledgement of the real-world phenomenon that says, this is my chessboard. I can do what I want with it. Here in the House of Wargaming, we often make the joke, if we forget a modifier somewhere, if we forget a unit and kind of move them a little after the fact, what are the wargaming cops going to kick down our door? What, are they going to shoot my dog and arrest me for missing that modifier? It's funny, it's a joke, because of course they're not. If I decide I'm going to play chess by moving this bishop straight, what are the chess cops going to come beat me up? Well, no. But now we start, in fact, we could even, hey, look, here comes Mr. Checkers to say, come here, knights. Let's all get together, and if you make me king, if you kill all those people, I'll be your king and I'll rule justly. And now, hey, look, they go around and say, I'll beat up my guys and you beat up your guys, and now we're having fun playing chess, aren't we? Well, we're not really playing chess. We're just playing with a chessboard. The same thing is imminently possible with this set of rules. I'm not really playing Blackmore. I'm just playing with Blackmore. I'm not really playing D&D. I'm just playing with D&D. And that's where we circle the conversation back around to the Ship of Theseus. Now, I'll throw a graphic up here on the screen to show you, to kind of illustrate how this works. This is an intellectual exercise, obviously posited by the Greek philosophers, hence the Theseus reference, in which they say, hey, Theseus has a ship. What if we take a couple of planks out, set them aside, replace him, so he can go on some more adventures? And he comes back to port. We take out a few more planks. We set those aside, and he goes out and has adventures. Then he comes back, and we take a mast, and we repeat that process over and over and over again until after 10 years, we've got the entire ship of Theseus sitting over here on the docks. And we build a second ship. Here's our second ship, and here's our original ship of Theseus. Now, I'm using chainmail, of course, and they have different names because they're a different game, but this game, when you add in all of these supplements, men and magic, it's commonly referred to, Monsters and Treasure, Greyhawk, Blackmore. This game is commonly referred to as OD&D, and this is commonly referred to as 5th edition D&D. Boy, she's really, who are you rolling on? There we go. 5th edition D&D. Well, now we have a Ship of Theseus situation where, which is the real one? And I'm not here to tell you which is the real D&D. I'm not here to tell you which of these is better. I'm not here to tell you which one you should be playing. What I'm here to tell you is that you should be honest with yourself about what game it is you're really playing, and don't rely on Rule 0 to argue that because you're playing one or the other, you can change whatever you want. The problem with this style of chess is twofold. The first problem is, if I'm playing chess by making my knight make out with the queen, and then I try to talk to a genuine chess player, we're going to have some difficulties in communication. We're not going to be able to actually talk about chess because we mean very different things. Language is important. If I, as a chainmail player, am talking about D&D with a 5th edition player, we're not going to be able to communicate. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people who will exploit this miscommunication. They will refer to Calvin Ball Rule 0. They will rely on the fill in the gaps Rule 0 to justify Calvin Ball Rule 0. So that's the first one, the difficulty of communication. The second problem is that when you say the only rule that is sacrosanct is the rule that says no rules are sacrosanct, then it raises the question of, what are you really doing? Are you even playing the game if you don't care about any of the rules? Why don't you just set this aside and play this game? The rules define the game. And if you want a different game, go play a different game. So at the end of the day, the suggestion that I have for you is that if you want to improve your game playing, be honest about what you're doing and do your best to cleave to the rules as written as closely as you can. Adopt a stringent criteria for which you admit you're no longer sailing on the ship of Theseus, and you're sailing on an entirely different ship. Try to stick to the rules as much as possible. The better game designers will admit that it's impossible. And from a personal perspective, those of you that have been with the channel for any length of time will know that we're not perfect at this. This rule, what would we call it? Rule prime. I try to play even a game like this, which is designed to be broken and fiddled with and handled in a lot of ways. Even a game like this, try to play it using the rules as they are written to the greatest extent possible. Before you go off and start making your own Blackmore, and this may be a bad example because Blackmore it used the rules of chainmail, but was kind of its own thing. But Dave Arneson, when he wrote this, he understood how to play chainmail. He was comfortable enough with the rule set to be able to take it in some strange new directions. And at a certain point, he had to stop and step back and say, you know, I'm not really playing chainmail anymore. Even Dave Arneson said, I'm doing something different. And through his collaboration with Gary Gygax, created an entirely new, let me back up. Gary Gygax et al., because we all know by now that Dave Arneson was building upon the works of it's so embarrassing. I don't remember his name now. Major David, I'm going to put a really obvious edit in here while I look it up. Major David Wesley, how embarrassing, who was himself influenced by a host of diplomacy players, and perhaps even by guys like the great Donald Featherstone and Tony Bath. Getting a little off topic here. Who invented D&D is not so important, as is the concept of, if you're going to play a game, play the game. And don't use Rule 0 as a crutch to play a not version of the game while trading on the credibility and the history and the reputation of that game. And if you try to cleave to the rules as close as possible, if you're honest about what you're doing, you'll have a much easier time gaining a profound understanding of the fundamentals of that game. And then when you go to fill in the gaps, then when you go to expand upon that game, you'll have a much easier time. To use another analogy, don't start tinkering with the engine of a car before you've even sat behind the wheel and taken it for a drive. If you decide that you're going to camp out, if you decide to use your car as a camper, and you park it in your driveway and you sleep in it and you live out of it, are you really driving a car? I think that analogy got away from me. But I think the point of this video is clear. Be honest about what you're doing, and you'll have a much easier time getting better at what you're doing. And 2, try to avoid the people that confuse and confound issues by using the modern nothing really matters version of Rule 0 with the more Gygaxian appreciation of Rule 0. One last thought, if none of the rules mean anything and you can do whatever you want, then accomplishing anything within that set of non-rules doesn't mean anything. It's a challenge without obstacles. It's everybody gets a trophy style of gameplay, and the rewards that you receive are very ephemeral and very superficial. So there's also that aspect, which we didn't get into a whole lot. There are some things that you can do that will help make your game playing better when you start to directly apply Rule Prime. I'm going to use the rules as written to the greatest extent possible. When you use that, there are certain knock-on effects. It does make your life harder. It does push you to your limit of gameplay, but if you are diligent and if you keep at it and if you ask for help from people that have done it, you will master a game and you will be rewarded with the profound feeling of satisfaction that you did it. You conquered the game. You overcame the obstacle, not by fiat, but by diligence, hard work, and dedication. And there are few better feelings in this world than that. So don't cheat yourself. Don't cheat the game. Try to play by the rules as written as much as possible. And if you don't like the rules, there's a lot of other games over there. Some of them are better for your purposes than others. Pick the right game, rules as written, go forth, make your game life better. You too can win at RPGs. That's all I got for you today. Remember, I'm praying for you.